welcome Andy Holten here today. He has been an extremely important member of our committee in helping bring this exhibit to the library. He has been an active member. He volunteers as an exhibit attendant. He's helped us plan our programs. He's helped us with all of our other aspects of bringing this exhibit to the library. He has been such an important part of it. So thank you, Andy, for everything you have done for us. We appreciate it.
Okay. I'm going to be talking about my experience as a hidden child. And a little introduction, and I'll talk more about it as I go on. But I was not hidden in a closet or in a hole in the ground, as some people were, but I was living with a family who didn't really know my name. I had been given a false name, so I was living with them. I was able to go outside a little, and that did not, it posed a little bit of a risk, but not too great, and the people that were taking care of me were willing to take that. So anyway, I'll explain more as I go along. Okay, next slide please. All right, introduction, Andre J. Holten. My middle name is John, and it has special meaning for me. And I'll explain later on, I hope to remember. It's really important for me when I think of that, of the middle name. It's John, but I'll explain how I got there. I was born a couple of years before the Second World War started in Holland, the Netherlands. I was part of a Jewish family, and these are my parents. Aaron and Claire Houtkruijer. My original name was Houtkruijer. I changed it along the way to Holten. So that's sort of the intro, okay? Next, please. All right, another picture from history. Before I was even born, 1933, New Year's Eve, Houtkruijer New Year's Eve party. My parents are the two people in the back on the right. The two men standing on the left, I think, are my uncles, brothers of my father. The two people in the middle are my grandparents on my father's side, and the other people, I do not know who they are. That's just a picture that I happened to get, a little bit of history. Next, please. Okay. Hitler, and as the exhibit talks about, of course, Hitler came to power in 1933, and he had two objectives in my mind. One was to take as much of Europe as he could. He wanted an empire, a Third Reich, what he called the Third Empire. And then the second part was that he only wanted good people, Aryan people, the perfect people, to live in his empire. And people that were not perfect were a number of groups. Gypsies, handicapped people, Jews, and so on. And he had no room for those people in his empire. So his whole philosophy along the way was to get rid of the Jews. And that's, of course, what the exhibit also tries to show. He was trying to, initially, he was trying to emigrate, get the people out of the country, and when that didn't work all that well, he stopped the immigration, and then he focused extermination, getting rid of the Jews, okay? And that's what the exhibit implies, and that is what affected me, of course. So it sort of came to a head at Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. In November of '38, he encouraged, or he initiated the pogrom, getting the Jewish people out of their stores and he arrested like 300,000 Jews. He killed off about 1,000. No, I think it's less than that. 100 or so Jews were killed during that event. But it was an event that, if people living, Jewish people especially, if they're living in Germany, if they hadn't already left, that was certainly a sign to them that they had to get out of there. And that's when the immigration problems became even more difficult. I mean, and you see at the exhibit that the number of people applying for immigration skyrocketed, and of course, not too many countries could some countries helped as much as they could. The United States was not one of those, okay? And that's what the exhibit is all about. And I'm not going to go into that anymore. Anyway, the persecution of the Jews came to a head in November of 38. November 8. People during that event, the synagogues were burned or destroyed and so on. So the Kristallnacht was sort of an event, a main event prior to the war that came. Several hundred Jews were arrested and sent to camps and all. Okay, so that is sort of a critical point. Again, Hitler had been in power from 1933 already till 38, so he'd been in power 5 years, and he had, in my mind, he had indoctrinated the German people that the Jews were awful, that there was no room for them, and they had to get out of it. They had to get rid of the Jews. And anyway, he had brainwashed, in my mind, the German people with that idea. Okay, next please. Okay, Holland, Netherlands. We were occupied in May of 1940. Germans had already taken over Austria and some other countries, but in May of 1940 they took over the Western European countries, and Holland was one of them. So Holland was occupied then for the next 5 years by the Germans. They dictated all the rules and laws that applied to the Dutch people, okay? And those rules and laws were very difficult. Life changes for everyone. People had to carry identification cards, everyone. And if you were Jewish, then your card had a J on it, as you see there on the right. So if you were stopped somewhere where the Jews were not allowed, then they say, "Can I see your ID?" And then if it showed that you were Jewish, but had a J on it, then they could arrest you right then on the spot. Also, after a year or two, every Jewish person had to carry the Star of David if they were 6 years old or older, so that everyone knew again that these were Jewish people, and they might be in a place where they're not supposed to be. They might be on a train or in a theater or wherever, stores after hours or so. So again, the objective was to separate the Jews from the non-Jews. And that is what this is all about. They were excluded from most professions. If teachers, Jewish teachers, had to get out of the public schools, they had to find schools for Jewish kids. And that wasn't always easy. Same thing, the Jewish students had to find schools for Jewish kids. They had to get out of the public schools. So that is the kind of life that you saw in Holland in those early years of the war. Jews were forbidden to attend events, and so on. So that is sort of the life in the first 2 years of the war. Again, the separation. The Jewish people, a lot of them lost their jobs, and they had no income, and life was very, very difficult for them. Next, please. Okay, brief description of Holland. I'm sure most of you know, but it's a small country on the west coast there of Europe, and it's adjacent, well, it's got the North Sea on 2 sides, on the west side and the north side. And then on the east side is Germany, and the south side is Belgium, and then France. So if you wanted to leave the country, you didn't have too many options. Ships or boats or whatever was about your only chance. People left if they had the wherewithal, they could leave through France and go through Spain, and then hopefully catch a boat, or go across to Africa and catch the boats from there, and then maybe go to England or go to the United States. But as the exhibit again shows, getting the necessary papers was very difficult. There was a lot of papers that people had to come up with before they could get an immigration visa from the United States. And they had to have sponsors in the United States, people that would vouch for them, that if the necessary, they could support these people. And that's also part of the exhibit. Again, the difficulty in finding sponsorship and so on. So Holland, again, was a small country, 2 sides with water, flat, not like New Mexico, where you might go into the mountains and they would never be able to find you. But that was not really an option in Holland. And there were on the order of 130,000 Jews living in Holland at the beginning of the war. Quite a few had come from other countries like Germany or Austria. The Anne Frank family is an example of a family that came from Germany and came to Holland in the hope that Holland would remain neutral in case a war would start. Holland had remained neutral during the First World War, and some people said, well, maybe they'll be neutral again, and that would be a good place to be. So that is a sort of the situation in Holland at the beginning of the war, and of course during the war. Again, finding a ship that left Holland to go across to England or wherever was almost impossible. A few ships left at the beginning of the war, but not too many. Next, please. Okay, my family, my parents, we were living in a small town near Amsterdam, a town called Hilversum, and that's where I was born in 1937, just for information. And early in the war, my parents decided to move to Amsterdam. We moved in with my grandparents, my maternal grandparents. One of the reasons I found out not too long ago was that one of the neighbors were German sympathizers. And my parents didn't want to be near there. They wanted to get away from that situation. So we moved to Amsterdam. We moved in with my grandparents in the Jewish area section of Amsterdam. And actually, I'm standing there with my mother in front of the town apartment that belonged to Meet Peace. Meet Peace is the lady you see there at the bottom. She is the one that worked for the Anne Frank family. And she was the one, when the family went into hiding, she was the one who went around town to buy food and all the needs for the Frank family. And she was a real support for the Frank group, for the Frank family, okay? Anyway, she happened to live right next door to where I was living with my grandparents. So that apartment that I'm standing in front of, I showed that picture to Mick Geese when she was here in Albuquerque, about 20 years ago. And I said, I hope that she remembered something, but all she said is, "You like my curtains." I swear, I couldn't believe it. Anyway, I'm standing there in front of that apartment. During that time, I was living there in the early years of the war. I was able to go to a school for Jewish kids that was sort of right around the corner from where I'm standing there. Actually, Anne Frank lived also around the corner before they went into hiding, and so on. I remember once having to run home during an air raid. The sirens were going off and the planes were, I was real nervous. We had been released from the school and I was running home, and I still remember that I was very nervous, but someone from the family came to meet me. And I was very relieved. I don't know who it was that came to beat me. But anyway, so that is what happened during the early years of the war. Next, please. Okay, if you wanted to avoid arrest, and so if you knew that the Germans were looking for you, and they were looking for the Jews in Holland, but they were also looking for men, typically men, in the age range of 20 to 40 or 50 that they could use in their factories in Germany. So the men were also looking for hiding places. It's about the best way to avoid being arrested, okay? Living sort of secretly in a place where the people that were taking care of you wouldn't talk about the fact that there were people living there in their house. But that was not that easy, finding a hiding place. People had to feed you, and so you had to provide the people that were taking care of you, you had to provide them with the pensions, the coupons, not the pension, coupons that allowed you to buy the food. And you see there at the bottom there are some coupons that you were given every month for bread and butter and meat and so on. And you would get coupons, the number of coupons based on the size of your family. So if you had extra people in your house that you had to feed, you needed more coupons. And it wasn't that easy to get a hold of them. The people in hiding in your house, they would need to go to City Hall, pick up the coupons, and come back to the house. But that would sort of give away the secrecy. And so that was not a real viable option. So that was one reason why people were reluctant to take in people, okay? They had to take care of the feeding, of course, that became an issue. And so, also, it was not allowed. One of the first rules that came out, that was put out by the Germans was helping the Jews avoid arrest is a crime, and you could be subject to arrest. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Corrie ten Boom, the story of the lady that wrote the book, I forgot. The Hidden Place. Anyway, she lived in a town where I wound up, actually, Harlem. And that family was arrested. Good Christian family was arrested because they were helping Jews. That's an example of what the risks were of helping Jews, okay? And then there was also uncertainty about the neighbors. That was a big thing. I mean, about 10% of the people in Holland were sort of sympathizing with the Germans. So if they knew that there were some Jews or whatever people living trying to avoid arrest, and they would go to the authorities, they would get like a couple of bucks, 7.5 guilders actually is what it was for many years. So that was another reason. So people, if they didn't trust the neighbors, then they might be reluctant to take people into their house. And then finally, there was probably some animosity towards religion or because of religion. People said, I'm not going to help the Jews or something like that. So that's what was going on in the early years of the war. Next, please. All right. So my parents realized at some point that friends and family were disappearing. They would talk to them one day, and the next day the house would be empty. They had been arrested overnight, and they had they were gone. So my parents at some point realized that they'd better take some action too. So they initially talked to good friends of theirs, and they said, would you be willing to take us in? And these friends said, yeah, no problem. And then when my parents finally said, hey, we really need to go into hiding now, it's getting pretty urgent. These people said, I'm so sorry, we're sorry. My wife is expecting, we don't trust the neighbors, we cannot take you in. So then my parents had to think, I don't know the time period or whatever, but then they decided to talk to the resistance, the people that were helping people find hiding places or so. And they said, is there at least a chance that you can find a hiding place for a 5-year-old boy, that was me. And that must have been an awfully difficult decision. When I talk about it, I think about the people coming up to our borders, trying to come into the country and giving away their kids and all. A very, very difficult decision, and it's one of the things that, let's see, how should I say that, when they asked me, what does the Holocaust mean to you? One of the things is that when my parents had to decide to give away me and place me with a Christian family, that must have been awfully difficult. So anyway, that's what they did. The underground found a Christian family in a town called Harlem, near Amsterdam, and that's where I wound up. As I was moved to that family, I was given a different name. Instead of Andre Houtkruijer, I became Hans van Heel. And that was a name that somebody had picked up on the other side of the country. And they gave me that name. And they thought that that would help. So that the people that took me in, all they knew I was Hans van Heel. And they couldn't say anything else about me. Because I was a 5-year-old kid, Hans van Heel. Okay, so that is the way I lived then the rest of the war. Next, please. All right, here is a brief overview of my last 2 years of the war. I lived with the Meyer family. I lived in several places. I had to go from here and there, and I was given, as I said, a new name. Here you see part of a letter that I received from my parents. It's a letter of Dutch, of course, and it says, Dear Hansje. They had to address me by my hidden name. They couldn't address me to my real name because I was too dangerous if the letter would be intercepted. So anyway, the letter says, so what do you think now? I had to be very innocent. What do you think now? Already another letter. We don't have any stamps for you. Apparently he was into collecting stamps, and so it's very innocent. Okay, so I lived with that name, Hans van Heel, for the last 2 years of the war. I was not able to go to the public school when I turned 6 the third public school realized what the situation was. The principal realized what the situation was, and because there was no birth certificate for me, so they said, no, we cannot take it. It's too dangerous for us, for the teachers, for the kids, whatever. So then the people that were taking care of me went to a Bible school where their own kids had gone a number of years, 15 years earlier, and the Bible school said, yeah, we'll take them. So here you see a report card for me in second grade at that Bible school. And again, you probably can't read it, but it's made out to Hans van Hill. So that is how I lived then for those last 2 years of the war. Okay, next please. All right, my parents and my grandparents on my mother's side, my maternal, they were in hiding somewhere. I don't know exactly where, but they were discovered. They were arrested. And they wound up, after their arrest, in a camp in Holland called Westerbork. And it was sort of a transit camp, or a camp from where the trains left for the east, for Poland. And so my parents wound up at that camp, Westerbork. And here you see a change of address card that my parents made out to address to these friends of theirs that could not take them because they were worried about the neighbors and the wife was expecting. And it says the family Houtkryer and the family Dutch, my mother maiden name. They are in Barrack 67 at Westerbork, and this was in December of 43. So this card was made up at that camp while this change of address card was made up at Westerbork. And the next, please. Here is an interesting card. It's a registration card that was made up at Westerbork. And it says, has my father's name there, Aaron Houtkryer, and it has my mother's name, and it has my name. So the Germans there at that camp knew that I existed, but they also knew that they didn't have me. So they started looking extra hard for me. They arrested a friend of the family that was not Jewish, but in the hope that she would tell them where I was. And she was sent to a camp in Holland for a couple of months, and then she wouldn't tell them. She didn't know, and she was then released on Hitler's birthday. But also the fact, of course, that I was mentioned on that card was interesting to me. But then this card also became essentially a train ticket for my parents. It says that they were put on a transport on the 25th of January, 44. And it has the S in front of the name of the S, and then transport, I assume that's what it meant. S meant that was for punishment, because they were in hiding when they were arrested. They wound up in the punishment barrack at Westerbork. So this card became a train ticket, essentially, for my parents. And they left Holland then on the 25th of January. Next, please. Here is an account. There was a reporter who was working. He was Jewish. He had a job at this camp, Westerbork, and he wrote down the situation when that train on the 25th of January left Holland for Auschwitz. And he said most of the people came from the punishment barrack, and then the rest. It says people still do not know what happens to them when they get to the other end. So it was sort of a question mark. And then there's a model there. Actually, that model train is at the museum downtown. People had to stand up for 2.5 days as they went from Holland to Auschwitz. So it was a horrible, horrible trip. Older people, young people, everyone had to stand up or do the best they could somehow. And that's what that was my family went through, my parents went through, and my grandparents. And the second thing that I find sort of, in my mind, characterizes the Holocaust. People having to travel for 2.5 days, standing up to get to their place where they would be killed. So anyway, next please. This is an account of when the train arrived at Auschwitz, January 27th. It arrived at Auschwitz. Said the train arrived with 948 Jews. Half the people came off the train. They did a selection. They looked at the people to see if they had any use for them. If they were men in the 20 to 40 age range, they would keep them, send them to the factory. Some they kept some women, and they had no use for the kids. So half of the men were kept. Some of the women were kept. Again, they had some use for them. I don't know exactly what. And also, the rest went straight to the gas chamber, and that's where they died, including 122 children that were on that train. So that is what probably would have happened to me if I had been with my parents. Next, please. My father, he was selected to work at a factory. There was a factory nearby, Monovich, near Auschwitz, which was run by a company called IG Farben, and they had a contract with the German army to provide tires and mines and things like that, but they had to use the Jewish prisoners from Auschwitz. So my father worked in that factory. By the way, I think Eli Wiesel also worked in that factory. He worked there, but typically people didn't last very long. They were worked very long hours, and then they just were exhausted. So my father wound up in the hospital in June of that year, and then here you see that white strip. This was a release from the hospital on my father. It says, has his prisoner number and his name, Aaron Houtkriger, and that he was released on the 23rd of August of 44, and he was sent to Birkenau, which is where the gas chambers were. So that is what happened to my immediate family, and the next slide shows how the Dutch reported this initially on a website. Aaron Houtkriger, my family and his family. Aaron, he was killed at the age of 34 in August of 44. Clara Houtkriger, that's my mother, she was killed in January of 44 at the age of 30. And one child living with his parents survived the war. And that's me. For privacy reasons, they did not give any additional information. So, next please. My other grandparents on my father's side, they had been arrested even earlier. I don't have a whole lot of information, but I know that they wound up at Sobibor. Sobibor, you see a map there of Austria, Poland. Poland. On the right, you see in the center Sobibor, and on the south side there is Auschwitz. Sobibor was a very notorious camp while it was in operation. Holland alone sent on the order of 35,000 Jews to Sobibor, and only 19 survived from that camp. They had an uprising in October of 44, and they had an escape, no, 43. They had an escape, and then they closed the camp down. And there is a movie, by the way, Escape from Sobibor. They never used the camp again, and the only thing left is that wall with some plaques on it. That's the story of Sobibor. You don't read too much on it, but quite a few people were killed there at Sobibor during 1943. Okay, next please. All right, at the end of the war, the liberation, we were liberated
in May 5th of 1945. I was living with the Meyer family. You see a picture of me. There's a picture of me a number of years after the war was over. At the end of the war, the people registered the best they could the surviving Jews, so that in case anyone was looking for them, they would know where to find them. So they registered me the best they could. They didn't have good information. As you see there at the bottom left, it says Hautkrieger with a question mark. They weren't sure how to spell it. First name, they thought my name originally was Arnold, it was Andre. And then they said date of birth, approximately 1937. That's what they assumed at the time. And then they gave an address in Harlem, which is where they would be able to find me if anyone came looking for me. So people have been all over the world, and if they were looking for me, then they wouldn't be able to find me. But no one came back. So I stayed with the Meyer family. These were the people who spoke up for me. They were wonderful people. And they, at the end of the war, no one came back to claim me. They would have been able to give me to an orphanage or do something, but they elected to keep me. And they were wonderful people. I mentioned at the beginning my middle name is John. I picked the name after my foster father. When I became a citizen, I changed my last name, and at the last moment, actually, I went back into the office, and I said, I want to add a middle name, and I picked the middle name John after my foster father, because I was so grateful for what he did. Okay, I stayed with the Meyers, finished grade school, finished high school. The Meyers made sure I got a good education. They were really on my case, and I appreciate it. I stayed with them until I finished high school. Then I was able to immigrate. My immigration happened, and this exhibit here reminded me of that. The United States made a special allowance. The story is a long story, but I won't go. They made a special allowance for war victims. So I was able, this was in 1956, 11 years after the war, I was able to immigrate real quickly as a war victim. And I was really appreciative of that, of course. I had finished high school, and it was a good time for me to immigrate, and I didn't have to wait very long. I applied in May of '56, and I was gone in December, so I was real fortunate. The law that the United States used for war victims and all was related to laws that the United States had dealt with during the war. It was sort of an extension, anyway. All right, so as a war victim, I was able to immigrate, and I came to the United States. Next, please. Okay, while in the States, I attended and graduated from City College of New York in New York City, got a degree in physics, played a lot of soccer along the way. I played that in Holland, and I played that in New York, and so on. After graduation from college, I'd been here for 5 years. I was able to become a citizen. I applied to become a citizen while the draft was after me, but I applied for citizenship, and then I was able to apply to become an officer. And I became an officer in the Air Force. And I was in the Air Force for about 5 years, and then I went to work for the Air Force as a civil servant, so it's a long history. Later, I came to Albuquerque, worked here for a company, BDM. There's some old BDMers here. There they are. And BDM brought me here to Albuquerque, worked for them for a number of years, and then I retired, and I became a substitute teacher. And I worked as a substitute teacher here in Albuquerque for 22 years or so. I know you may question my sanity, but anyway, I'm retired now from substituting, and I am now doing miscellaneous stuff. So anyway, next please. Okay, why do I talk to groups like yourself? Well, it's important to know something about the Holocaust, and the exhibit talks about what happened from the American side, what the Americans were thinking and dealing with the war and with the Jewish people that were trying to immigrate. Anyway, something to remember. Approximately 6 million Jews were killed during the war. Holland alone lost on the order of 100,000. Now there's 130,000 living there. A little over 100,000 were killed. 6 million. I know you all can appreciate it, but it's 60 times all the people that can fit in the Dallas Cowboy Stadium. And so one of the messages I'd like to leave as part of my presentation is we must all practice tolerance. We have to accept people. We cannot decide that a whole group of people aren't worthy of living. It's just crazy in my mind. And the second slide, please. The other experience, the other message is I experienced the worst of what people do. Exterminating people, just not asking any questions, arresting them, sending to the extermination camps in Poland or wherever. It was a horrible, horrible experience. So that is, but I also experienced the best of what people could do. The Meyer family took me in, didn't know me, but just took me in and treated me like their own. The Meyers had already raised their own kids. Their own kids were like in the age of the early 20s when they took me in, and they had me as a 5, 6, 7-year-old. Anyway, they're wonderful people. They were actually recognized by Yad Vashem, the Israeli memorial park or whatever. They recognized people, righteous Gentile, people that helped the Jews survive the war. So the Mayas were recognized. Last slide is something from Anne Frank, and it says, everyone is inside him, so good news. That's what Anne Frank said. Don't know how great you can be, how much you can love, and how much you accomplish, and what your potential is. And by the way, just as a sideline, I found out about 7 years ago, that I'm related to Anne Frank. If you go back 10 generations to the 1600s, there were two sisters. One lived in Germany, and Anne Frank was related to her, and there was another sister, second sister, who lived in Holland, and I was related to her. And I didn't find that out, but the genealogy people figured that out, and they sent me an email one time, and I assumed that was correct. I checked all out, and the best I can tell, it's true. It doesn't buy me anything, but it's true. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Very much. If anybody has any questions, if you could just raise your cards and somebody will collect them and bring them up to me. We'll give Andy a chance to get some water and relax for a second before we put him on the spot again. Anybody else? Any other cards? So we got a little bit of time.
Jenna, do you have any extra cards up there?
I do not. If anybody didn't use their card, could you hand it to Tracy so that way we can get a couple more questions on it. And thank you all for coming. If you need to leave, we appreciate your support of the exhibit, and we appreciate you coming and hearing Andy talk today. Thank you. Okay. So our first question from the audience is, what is your experience speaking to younger people, and do they know of the Holocaust?
I don't have have statistical numbers. A lot of people don't know much. Kids, when I was in school, and as I said, I asked, what's Auschwitz or what's the Holocaust, and got blank stares and all. So, not too many people, and that's why I am now still talking about this the best I can, and as long as I can, because I think it's something that people have to remember. It was an incredible event that was fostered by the bureaucracy, by the whole country, and so on. And it's something that's unique, and obviously it affected me greatly. So I encourage people to learn more about it, and so on. Okay?
Thank you. Our next question is, how did you get your picture of your mom and dad? I would think it would have been difficult to preserve.
Well, that's a good question. They sort of came out of the woodwork, is all I can say. I did not record how I got them or where they came from. There was a photographer in Amsterdam who had some pictures, and the friends of the family. There was this lady that I mentioned earlier who went to prison because she was a friend of the family, and she had some pictures. And I don't know how I got them all. I should have recorded it all. I wish I had, but I don't know. I have about 8 or 10 pictures altogether from my family, and that's all I really know. I have very few memories of my parents. I think I have some memories of traumatic events when there was a raid or a search going on, and my parents didn't know what to do, and I think I sort of picture a room that I was in where my parents were discussing what to do and so on. And that's all I remember. I don't know how I got the pictures. I'm fortunate that I have that many. And as I said, once I was written up in the Dutch paper, in an American paper, and I went to Holland, and I was in a Dutch paper, and people read that, and I said, they wrote me, or they read my foster mother, said, we remember him. We thought I was a kid, or we thought that he survived the war. It would be great if it was him, and so on. So they had a picture of me with their daughter or something. Anyway, that's all I can say.
How did you learn your real name if the Meyers didn't know it?
How did I?
Learn your real name.
That's the last witness.
Your real name.
Oh, well, again, the lady that I mentioned a moment ago that went to camp because they figured she knew where I was. She survived the war, she was not Jewish, and I befriended her. So she became my aunt. I call her Tantanita. And she was a wonderful lady, and actually she gave me that hidden name. But she also then told me what my real name was and where I was born. And then I went to City Hall and got my birth certificate and so on. So that's how I found out.
Thank you. Did you visit the Meyer family after emigrating?
Did I?
Visit the Meyer family?
Did I visit?
Visit.
Huh?
Visit.
Visit, yeah. I did visit them many times, quite a few times. I sort of feel like I'm the patriarch now of the family. My foster parents have passed away. My foster siblings have passed away. They were already 15 years older than me, and they have passed away. So I am now the representative, if you wish, of my foster parents with the kids, with the grandkids. And I contact them on their birthdays. They are spread out all over the place, and then I'm not that many of them, but I talk to them on their birthdays. I talked to one this last Sunday, and to say hi and how you doing and so on. So I'm definitely, you know, that's the only family I had. And the grandkids are already in their 60s or 70s. And so actually one has passed away. And so anyway, I'm still involved as much as I can with my foster family. It's the only family I have. My real family, I have discovered 2 great aunts. They have since passed away. And I have discovered several cousins. And I have contact with them. Actually, one lives in Arizona, and one lives, a couple live on the East Coast, and one lives in Holland still. So I'm still in contact with them.
The next question is, what year did you relocate to Albuquerque?
What year?
What year?
Well, I came here. Let's see. I came here in '78 and worked for BDM for a number of years and all. And I started subbing in '99, I think. And someone, actually the principal of Eagle Ridge, was a friend of mine, and she talked me into becoming a sub. It took me a year to decide to do it, but I became a sub based on her recommendation. And so I started subbing in '99, and I quit early last year. That's part of when the pandemic started. Does that answer the question?
Is it common for people to know what happened to family members during the Holocaust?
Say that again.
Is it common for people to know what happened to family members during the Holocaust?
I'm not sure. Can I read it? In my case, I joined the family, the Meyer family, when I was 5 years old, in the middle of the war, and they had, as I said, 3 children of their own in their early 20s, and each one of them, each one of the children, had a friend who was basically in hiding with us. One was a friend of a daughter, and he was Jewish, so he was in hiding. So he was also in the early 20s. And then the son had a friend who came over to the house quite a bit. I can't remember exactly how often. And then there was another, the other daughter had her friend, a friend was hiding with us because his parents were German sympathizers. And he didn't want his parents to know where he was. So he was in hiding. So those 3 young adults, they were sort of my buddies, if you want to call it that. They played with me as I was growing up. And so I learned, you know, what the situation was about slowly but surely. I didn't understand initially what the war was all about, but I slowly but surely I started learning about what was going on. Okay, and then of course after the war, they were still around. They got married pretty quickly, but I still became very close to them. Okay, I hope that sort of answers the question. Thank you. Okay?
Thank you. Were there any other questions?
Yeah.
How old were you when you found out about your parents and what had happened to them, and how did you find out?
Okay, it's a good question. How did I find out? I was 7 years old at the end of the war. About 2 or 3 years after the war, the adults around me, I don't know exactly who, they put an inquiry in with the Red Cross. And the Red Cross came back with flaky information. They said my parents had left on a train from Holland to go east. That's all they said. And everyone knew pretty much that when those trains left, they went either to Auschwitz or some other camp. So I lived with that information starting when I was about 10 or 11. I started with that information, and I lived with that information, very wishy-washy, not clear. I lived with that for many years. And then later on, I put in an inquiry to the Red Cross again. And they came on with more definitive information. They said my father, he had been given a prisoner number, and he worked in a factory in Monovich, and my mother and my grandparents were straight to the gas chamber as soon as they arrived at Auschwitz. So that's what the most definitive information that I received. Okay, does that answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Good question. Yeah.
On May 5th, when Holland was liberated, how did you find out?
What's that?
How did you find out Holland was liberated? Was there an announcement? Was it on the radio?
It was on how Holland was liberated. It was the Canadians and American troops moved into the city. And I remember standing along the street as the Canadians came in on the trucks and all. And that was the liberation. Everyone was happy and everyone was festive because at least we would get fed. The last winter from November 44 to April 45 is called the hunger winter. Holland was very cold and people didn't have any supplies, no food, no heating. The people would scarf wood wherever they could find it. The trees, they cut down trees overnight, or they took beams from train tracks or whatever just to feed into. So people were desperate for something, and people were real happy after the hunger winter to be liberated. Now Holland, the southern part of Holland had been liberated, even though it's a small country. The southern part had been liberated in the fall of 44. But the Allied troops were not able to come up to the northern part of Holland until after that bad winter. So in May of 45, they moved in. All of a sudden, the army and whatever, the trucks were moving into the city. So everyone went. Okay.
Thank you.
Do you remember the bells of the churches ringing? Do you remember that?
No.
That is what happened in Italy.
Yeah.
The bells were ringing.
The bells of church, yeah. I don't remember that.
Well, you were little.
Yeah, we lived near a church, and there was, it's a
And
long
some of the
story.
bells were used to make candles, so maybe they were the main bells.
All right.
Thank you all again for coming. Thank you, Andy, very much for honoring us with